This episode of The King's Hall is brought to you by Ideal Poultry and our supporters at patreon.com.
Well, welcome to another episode of the King's Hall podcast. My name is Brian Sauvé, joined by two Chad Kings. Eric Kahn, say hi to the people.
What's up, my people?
Hello. Dan Burkholder.
Whoa, wait your
sultry,
turn, Dan.
wow.
I was just
The
kidding.
sultry, dulcet tones. No, I liked the back-to-back.
Jazzy jazz.
Because everyone could hear, they were like, that's Eric, because it sounds like he's about to talk about the Aeneid.
The Aeneid.
And then that's Dan.
I'm not gonna lie, I was not paying attention, and I just heard "say hello to the people," and so I did.
He was locked in.
I was
Dan
reading about Odysseus.
He was in deep work. Deep work. Well, in this episode, we have an interview that we are very excited to share with you with pastor, real estate investor, grandfather, right?
Oh, yeah.
Grandfather, Pastor Chris Wiley. You may know him as C.R. Wiley, author.
Or the real life Tom Bombadil.
The actual Tom Bombadil. And Mr. Wiley is just one of those guys that as soon as we started the King's Hall, even way back, as soon as we started the publishing house, he was on our short list of men that we said we need to get a book from Chris Wiley at New Christendom Press. And so we did.
Tell
us about it, Eric.
Yeah, he was. Chris was kind enough to agree to do a book with us. So he had really proposed the idea. We were kind of talking through a number of themes, and he proposed a book on risk, which I think is phenomenal. And so we got to see the outline for that. Hope to have a rough draft. I think we're in like November, and we'll see how long production takes. But
Yeah.
I'm excited about it. I think there's such a need. Particularly, we talked about in this season for fatherlessness, but we're also blessed that we do have some older men in the church who get the problem.
Yeah.
I think a lot of us just kind of look to Chris as like he's this sage older guy who gets it.
Yeah.
And he wants to help.
Yeah, Dan, when you think about C.R. Wiley and fathers and the need for fathers in the church, what strikes you as some of the reasons that this is a guy that our listeners should be paying attention to and heeding when he speaks?
Yeah, when you have a guy who has had success in ministry and in investing and in building a legacy, and it seems like that guy's in your corner, man, it means a lot.
Yeah.
It really does. It means a lot. Instead of having, kind of the theme that's going around right now is that you have a lot of older guys that it seems like they're just punching down, relentlessly, and it just really grows tiresome. So it's really nice to have that respectable guy that he has a lot lot of experience, and that made him sound like he's really old. He's not that old, but
no,
but
he
no,
probably
like a
deadlift
guy.
more than a lot of our listeners. And I believe
his grip strength is
it's probably
through the
very
roof.
high.
No, so I mean, it's nice to have a guy who's had success and has had experience, who's in your corner saying like, no, actually, you can do this. Like, don't listen to those guys. Like, you can do it. Go for it.
And then,
give it a shot.
And telling you how.
Yeah.
Giving you practical help. His Household for the War and The War for the Cosmos, and some of the other books he's written, The Man of the House. These are books that really blend that wisdom, biblically rooted wisdom that is seasoned by life experience, and then has practical handholds that you can grab onto. So we're really glad to share this interview with you, and hopefully we'll continue to be able to talk with Pastor Wiley and share more with you guys over the months and over the season maybe. But if nothing else, look out for that title. We'll be letting you know as it gets closer. So you can buy a case of them for you, your family, coworkers, neighbors, just giving them unsolicited to people's mailboxes around you, that sort of thing. This is a business, folks. Like, you got to help us out here. So
Yeah, just think, if you bought one copy for every American and gave it away,
think
what
about
a
it.
difference you can make.
Think about the difference you could make.
That's only like 600 plus million copies.
I mean, come on. Yeah.
How big is the ask? It's big.
It's big, but it's meaningful. It's meaningful. Yeah, I agree with you, Dan, that it's so rare to find a guy who has the experience, who could look down on everybody beneath him and say, like, oh, you whippersnappers. Like, you, again, we're making him sound really old. He's not really that old. But who could say, I've, been there, done that, be condescending, punch down, and instead for a guy to be like, no, I'm for you. I'm with you. I'm behind you. Go for it. You can do it. And here's some wisdom on how.
Yeah.
So I think we're ready to roll the interview. Ray, go ahead and roll that interview for us.
Well, welcome to this episode of the King's Hall podcast. We are in season 2. We're dealing with father hunger, and I am one of your hosts, Eric Kahn. I'm joined today by Pastor Dan Burkholder, and we have a very special guest, Dan. We have Mr. Chris Wiley, or as maybe the audience knows him as C.R. Wiley. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Eric. Great to be with you and Dan. I'm glad to spend some time with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Chris, one of the things that we're excited to talk about with New Christendom Press is, of course, having you on as an author. And I wanted to kind of kick things off to talk about one of the books that you'll be writing for us titled Risk. Now, when I first saw it, I saw the list of chapters that you were thinking of working through. I shared it with the guys here. We were immediately excited about it. So I guess just give us a snapshot, elevator pitch. What is this book about? And how did you get to thinking about these ideas?
Well, the first part of the question is, what's it about? Essentially, there's no such thing as a risk-free life. So I think we need to deal just forthrightly about risk avoidance and why it's a really risky thing to do and dumb. So now that you've got that idea in mind, then the question is, well, what sort of risks are smart? What sort of risks are dumb? And how do you proceed? And then, since that's the case, what are some strategies for evaluating risks and taking good risks and so forth? And then, I think a lot of folks understand that there is a kind of a risk-reward kind of metric that's in play. The safer you play the risk game, the lower your return is likely to be. But that doesn't mean that every crazy risk is a good thing. So, and then when you make decisions that entail risk, how do you protect yourself on the downside? How can you hedge that? How can you make sure that your family is not put in a dangerous position? Those sorts of things. So that's basically the nature of it. So the proposed title is risk with an exclamation point. Go ahead and take the risk and buy this book. It might change your life. That kind of thing.
That's great. One of the things you talk about, at least in the outline, is I think it's your great 3 times or 4 times grandfather, Captain Nathan Bolin. So I've seen some of the stuff on Facebook about him, but tell me a little bit about him and his story and why that's relevant.
Yeah, well, he's someone I've been learning about recently, primarily because my sister has done all of the work on our family tree. And he's not the only one who had a really remarkable life, but he is the one who killed the corrupt marshal in Arkansas, William Morris, in an open gunfight in Gainesville, Arkansas. That's like kind of famous.
Yes.
And I had no idea that, but he actually was a bushwhacker, and the bushwhackers were Confederate guerrilla fighters after the war, even during the course of the war, who fought in southern Missouri and in Kansas. And the film The Outlaw Josie Wales is actually based on those guys. And
cool.
So my ancestor, the Captain Nathan Bolin, this wasn't the only gunfight he'd been in. I've learned more about him and his history. But this particular episode, he was acquitted for. So he'd actually turned himself in after killing the marshal, but the marshal was so corrupt, everybody admitted he had grounds to kill him.
That's great.
So he went. So the marshal had essentially said, "If I see him, I'm going to kill him." And Nathan Bolin, my ancestor, said, "If I see him, I'm going to kill him," because he actually had killed his brother Jesse. His Jesse had been pursued by a posse, and William Morris had him shot execution style right on the spot when he was captured. So that was the blood feud that was between these two guys. But Nathan Bolin had been a captain in the Confederate cavalry in Elliott's Rangers or something like kind of a famous company in the Confederate cavalry. Anyway, I think it's Elliott's Scouts. But this is following the war. What happened is, my ancestor, Captain Bolin, went to pay his taxes. So, he went to town armed, went to went to the post office to pay his taxes, and guess who was in the room when he walked in? It was William Morris. And while he's in there, and this is all, we have multiple newspaper accounts of the fight. So this is like highly documented encounter. And when my ancestor greeted everybody in the room except William Morris. Hey, hi, Bob. Hey, Steve. Hey, George. Then just skipped over and went to pay his taxes. And while he's paying his taxes, William Morris cocks his gun. It's in his pocket, cocks it. Everybody hears it. And so Bolin didn't even turn around. He just walked out the back door and was waiting for Morris in the street. And when he got outside, they had it out. And the first shot Captain Bolin took, he shot William Morris in his right arm. And he was unable to draw his own gun at that point. So I don't know if that was intentional. That's like so Josie Wales.
Yes.
You wonder, was that a mistake or was that intentional? I don't know. So Morris ran home, and his wife was waiting for him, and she had a loaded shotgun ready for him as he ran up. And so she just threw it to him. He turned around and unloaded on my great-great-great-grandfather and actually hit a couple of other people. And because there were people in the vicinity of the fight, Captain Bolin, he kind of, didn't immediately return fire, but when he did, he put him away, and then got on his horse and rode out of town. But I guess the risk factor here is just the danger of the moment and the coolness of his, deportment and how he encountered this man he knew wanted to kill him. Going around town and taking the risk, this is the weird thing, to pay your taxes. You're saying, I'm not going to let this guy prevent me from performing my civic responsibility of paying my taxes. I'm going to town. I'm prepared. This might be how it plays out, and it did. But that it's such a fun story that I just felt like I gotta. He was also at the Round Pond Massacre. And actually was one of the bushwhackers who attacked this Union supply sort of mule train that came in, and he killed a couple of guys in that. But anyway, he's got a very. So I'm planning. I'm actually speaking at a homeschool convention in Branson, Missouri, in March, which is only about an hour away from Gainesville. So I'm going to go down. I want to get a picture of this guy, so I can have a picture of my third great grandfather. He's just got to have that look in the eye. It says you don't want to mess with this dude. But anyway, that's my dream. Is I hope to be able to get a photograph of him. I'm also descended from Jenny Wiley, who was the pioneer woman who was abducted by a raiding party of Native Americans in Kentucky. And all of her children were massacred. And she escaped after giving birth to her, I think, seventh child, and that child was killed. But she got away. And there's actually a park in Kentucky named for her, the Jenny Wiley State Park in Kentucky. Oh, wow. So, there are different, and I've got others too. So I'm just sort of like exploring. So I might use her story as well in the book.
Yes. Yeah, I was going to ask you, Chris, one of the things that it strikes with me is I think for a lot of men, we resonate with stories about Josie Wales and what you're talking about with your grandfather. But what we especially resonate with, I think, is that knowing like these risk-taking, bold, courageous men were in our bloodlines too, right? And the idea that their blood is still in us. So what do you think it is about men that makes stories like that particularly enthralling to hear and to want to somehow maybe even live out part of it in our own lives? What do you think it is?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I know that when I learned these stories about my ancestors, I thought, wow. I mean, I've got some examples, people in my own line that I can look to for inspiration. And, I'm in some measure, I mean, it's pretty watered down now, of course. But in some measure, I'm connected.
Maybe you missed your calling as a gunfighter.
Yeah, I don't know. But anyway, but I do think because generally speaking, men have historically been charged with the task of protecting their loved ones, but also taking the risks required to give their loved ones an advantage in the world, something that they could give to them. There's something in the way that God has, I think, constituted the masculine frame of mind that makes these stories appealing and inspirational. Say, wow, those guys did that. I can do something similar in my own situation. I'm not going to get into an open air gunfight with a corrupt police official, but there are other sorts of risks that I can take that are going to, if they work out, be will enrich my family.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. One of the other questions I have is, especially thinking about risk and generations, one of the things I've tended to hear a lot of about, say, like the boomers, is there's this critique that they were the risk averse generation. So I guess my first question is, do you think that's true? Is there any merit to that? And maybe if so, why?
Well, I think in one way, boomers had a very unusual, kind of unprecedented sample of time. Following the Second World War, essentially all of our competitors were like rebuilding after just, being completely devastated,
Yeah.
So we were basically unchallenged in the global marketplace. We had, a country that's industrial machinery was still largely in place and functioning well, and people were returning home, and it was the opportunities that their parents didn't know, and they took it for granted. And I think they squandered some of their inheritance. You think about the 60s and what occurred during that time period. But I think because the frame of reference that they have is so unusual, they don't appreciate how good they had it, and they don't appreciate how things have changed for even their own children and grandchildren, how things are not the same. Risk averse, yes, in a lot of ways, I think they just found themselves in a world where things were being done for them that hadn't been done for other generations, and it, in many respects, was sort of an easier world to live in, a more comfortable world than even, like I noted, their parents and grandparents had known. I mean, their parents and grandparents had experienced First World War, the Great Depression, Second World War. Boomers, as they're part of the baby boom that came on the scene after the Second World War. So the 50s, 60s is pretty. Yeah, we had the Cold War, and there's Korea and Vietnam and so forth. But nevertheless, they had a boom economy that they enjoyed, and a lot of economic opportunity that their parents and grandparents hadn't enjoyed, and I think their children don't enjoy today. Doesn't mean that there aren't opportunities today. I do think that there are, and I do think that there are things that young people can do that will put them in a really good position going forward. But it's not the same.
Yeah, it brings up a good question. I think something that at least we've noted, I think you've probably seen too, judging on some of your Facebook posts. There seems to be a divide, right, between boomers and really Gen Z, millennial. You see a lot of complaints. For my money, it's kind of an interesting one because you have boomers and then their offspring who, there's animosity on both sides. We got the OK Boomer movement, sort of dismissing the older generation. But then on the flip side, too, you also have, boomers saying it's the most selfish generation of all time. And we might retort, well, they're also like, you raised them. So where did it come from? So one way or the other, that you can know that there's generational divide. So my question to you is, do you see that? And what do you think is contributing at the core to that division?
So I'm a bit of an odd duck. So I was a late boomer, and my parents were kind of bohemian. My father was a professor or on faculty, very junior, at Washington U in St. Louis, and then before that at University of Buffalo. So in my early years, I was in this sort of artsy, experimental, everybody seeking kind of environment. And one of the things about the me generation is that there was a deep conviction that you weren't really defined by your social roles, that you had to find yourself. That self that you were looking for invariably was in California or someplace you weren't, and it was always somehow found when you abandon your dependents and stuff like that. So that's what happened in my case. So I was a kind of an early, I guess, latchkey kind of kid, you could say. I was pretty much on my own by the time I was like 9 years old. And then when our household fell apart, I was warded the state, lived in public housing, and so forth. So I got acquainted with a whole other kind of world, which was sort of the underclass and, people who are dependent upon the state for their survival and stuff like that. So I've had that. And then my family was kind of, this is really weird, kind of wealthy. So my grandparents were pretty well to do. So I've got kind of these segments or slices of in terms of my life and my experience. And some I'm comfortable in a wide range of environments for those reasons. And then I spent my teen years in Western Pennsylvania in a very blue collar. This is during the period of time where I was a ward of the state. A very blue collar environment where there were a lot of men who worked with their hands that I came to admire and was really positively influenced by. So there was some surrogate fatherhood kind of dynamics there with those guys. So that's why I have an interest in sort of blue collar interests, trades and hunting and things like that. But in terms of this dynamic, the two generations, I think partly it's due to a reaction that some boomers had to the neglect that they felt that their parents were guilty of. So they became the kind of the helicopter parent generation, and didn't give their children enough room to really kind of encounter the world in the ways that maybe would have been more conducive to success. So there are, I think, some challenges that millennials face in kind of getting over the sort of the cocoon environment that maybe that they feel like they were raised in certain cases, and kind of get out there and experience the world. And I think that's one of the unintended consequences of the way boomer parents worked with their kids or treated their kids. In terms of how the world has changed, I think that because obviously, people are super connected through social media and stuff like that, there are things that, young people have access to today that boomers just simply didn't have access to. I mean, when I was a kid, there were basically three networks, television networks, and PBS. So, everybody was watching the same shows, and they were pretty mainstream. I mean, like Partridge Family was maybe the most risque out there.
Right.
So there's that dynamic, and then of course because of globalism and because of the way that the sort of the global economy has transformed the American economic landscape, there are just certain things that are different. So like when I was young, I knew a lot of guys who really did see the blue collar life as really the life to pursue. Their fathers had worked in the factories. They intended to pursue the same kind of life. Those were the days where you could really afford. I mean, there really were people who were working, for like say Pittsburgh Plate and Glass, PP&G, who could afford a home. Mom could stay at home and raise the kids. They could still afford a pickup truck and a car. And that was normal. That's not the case, generally speaking, today. If you're going to pursue that kind of life, you got to do it very intentionally, and it's just not a given like it was at that time. And of course, during the late 70s, early 80s, with offshoring, all those factories were shut down. Those places that had been, vibrant blue collar communities were in just a state of depression economically, but also just sort of in terms of demoralized. And then everybody was encouraged to go to college, and that was seen as being the only legitimate avenue to kind of get ahead in life, and then people pursued that, and initially it was not all that expensive, but over time, we've seen inflation in higher education, outpace inflation in the rest of the economy several times over. So now we find a lot of young people who find themselves almost in a state of indentured servitude. They've got $50, $60, $80,000 of student loan debt. I've seen it because I'm a landlord, and I see the credit reports for many of the young people, particularly young women, and it's unbelievable. These are women who are, want to be nurses or elementary school teachers, and they've got $60,000 of student loan debt plus the loan on the car that they feel like they need to have, which they think needs to be new because they don't want to have it break down, somewhere and not have any way to take care of the problem. They just don't have that wherewithal to do that, and so so a lot of the institutions in our society have taken advantage of the situation that millennials and Generation X and so forth find themselves in. So yeah, that's very different. I don't. When my wife and I graduated from college, our combined student loan debt was $20,000. That was, in today's money, not insignificant, but we were able to handle it. It was also the lower cost of living in every other way. We bought our first two-family for $135,000 in the south section of Boston. It's worth almost $1 million today. It's just, it was just a different time. So there are significant differences today, and I don't think that boomers are fully appreciate those differences. Now, that's not to say those differences can't be, or the new challenges can't be met. I think they can. There just needs to be an approach taken that our public institutions are not encouraging young people to take, but you can do it. So I know young people who are doing just fine, but they basically defied the conventional wisdom every step of the way.
Right.
Back in the day, you could just sort of follow the conventional wisdom and do fine. Today, you got to defy the conventional wisdom in order to do well.
Yeah, so I think part of the generational divide is that millennials and Zoomers find boomers' advice to not be very helpful in the current situation because, like you said, they don't know the times as well. So just, I guess, as like a father, what sort of fatherly advice would you give to men today, that would be helpful for them to build their house?
Yeah. Well, I have two grown sons, and so I've done it.
Yeah.
And maybe you could have them on the show sometime, and they could tell their side of the story.
Yeah.
But they're both married. They both have children. They both own their own homes. So, they're doing it. So my oldest son went to Wheaton College, married a beautiful girl there, and kind of did the more conventional approach to things. But, all the way along, we would talk about these matters and talk about getting into property and how to go about it. So I actually was involved with the purchase of the homes for both of my sons. I didn't give them money directly, but because I still had my real estate license, I was in a position to give them the referral, that I had received in both cases. And actually, my second son's case, I actually represented him and his wife. And as for their housewarming gift, I gave them my commission. I said, "Here you go, and a little money to help you get started." And in that case, I actually negotiated a really sweet deal for them. I actually was able to get the house that they ended up buying out of another contract and put them in a situation where they had great equity from the get-go in the house, far more than they actually put in. But that was because I had a high degree of involvement in their lives without controlling. I don't try to control them at all. But we talk all the time. We've got good relationships. So my oldest son works with us on the Theology podcast. He's our tech, handles all the stuff with that. But he's an audio engineer and works in Nashville and has many clients there, and works with like Lifeway and stuff like that. And then my second son he works with all of our real estate up in Connecticut, and so I'm on I'm texting with those both of those guys every week about different matters. So we're we're working together. But they also have their own businesses and things that they do. But I guess when it comes to what I say to young guys, I would say first of all, finding the right woman is really important, and there are things that you can do to identify that woman and um, win her. So there are high quality women out there. I know some guys are so jaded that they don't believe that's the case. Well, sure, if you spend all your time on Tinder, you're gonna find the wrong kind of girl, or spend your time in bars, singles bar. Yeah, you're not gonna find the kind. But there are a lot of really great gals out there still, and knowing where to look for them is important. Then knowing how to win them is also important. So I coached both of my sons through that whole process with both of their situations, and was pleased to see that they won the girl in both cases, both really great gals. I think that's foundational. I think you also need to kind of have aspirations to control your life economically as well as you can, and plan to do that. Doesn't mean you don't work for other people, but it also means you don't like throw in your entire sort of future in with anybody either. You're kind of thinking about your own situation. So, like in the case of my second son, he works for a very large steel firm, construction company in the Hartford area, and he was able to go into them and just give them the ultimatum. He said, "Unless you give me what I want, I'm gone." And they give him everything he wanted. He's so good, and they want him so bad. He's 25 years old, and he's the lead fabricator in a company of like 250, 300 guys.
That's crazy.
So he was like, and they said, yeah, okay, we'll give you everything you want. But that ability to kind of make that kind of move, and he didn't even ask my advice about it. He just said, hey, Dad, this is what I'm going to do. I'm like, whoa, dude, you sure you want to do that? He's like, yeah. And it worked out great. So when he did that was when his wife was expecting, and he knew that he was going to have to carry the whole load. She had been working part-time. So he said, I need this much extra money in order to replace her income. And that was his goal. He says, I'm going to get that. And that's what he did. And so he had the confidence in his own abilities, and a good sense of where he stood in sort of the opinion of his employers to make that step. So, in terms of what a father should do, I think a father should coach, have an ongoing conversations with younger men, particularly with his own sons, about a full range of things. What kind of house should you get? What kind of woman should you marry? What kind of approach should you take to property and livelihood and employment? All those kinds of things.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Chris, one of the things that Dan and I were talking about recently, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but there's this really popular YouTube channel. I think it's Dad, How Do I?
Yeah, I've heard of that.
We were looking at it and we're like, this is really interesting. But really kind of what it pointed out to us was like some of his most popular videos are one that's like, I'm proud of you.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
we're kind of watching it and we're thinking like, why does this resonate so much with this generation? I think you're getting to some of that, like the things that we should have got from fathers, just basic competencies. So maybe just talk just a little bit about when you're talking about building a house, you're talking about legacy, you're talking about inheritance. Why are just like practical manly competencies? Why is that so important to pass on and to have that body of knowledge?
Your competence is the basis very often for your authority in a practical sense. It's the person who knows what to do and when to do it that other people defer to. Now, obviously, as a father, you have a position in a household structure, and that position is kind of like royalty in the sense that you didn't do anything except to have kids. you know, you're in that spot. But we all know that you get a measure of, I guess, credibility just for that. But in order for you to carry forward with the work of a father in the course of the lives of your children, you've got to have more going for you than just simply I'm your father. If you're like a total idiot, you don't know how to do anything, all that stuff, at some point you just become a figurehead. and just like the royal family in the United Kingdom, you don't have any real influence. So, in order to have real influence in the lives of your children, not in a dictatorial way or manipulative way, I think sometimes guys resort to those things because they think that that's what they need to do in order to, exercise authority. But if you're going to have influence in a way that's healthy and actually enriches your children, then you have to master things and then be a source of insight and competence for them that they draw on. So over the years, my sons would work with me on our properties. They'd see me do real estate deals. They saw me, working with banks and even subcontractors, and a lot of that was just a process of osmosis. They'd see this occur, and they would have a sense that, oh, okay, that's feasible, that's possible. I could do that too. And then, you'd come down to learning practical skills. So both of my sons are highly skilled artisans and took the high road to mastering their crafts. So, like in the case of my oldest son, I remember a lot of his friends when he was a teenager were into Guitar Hero. Do you remember that thing?
Yes.
Where you
Yes.
pretend like you were a great guitarist, but you
Yes.
really didn't know how to do anything. And my son said, "Well, what? Why don't they just learn how to play the guitar?" So he taught himself how to play it. He's an accomplished musician and he's a master of a number of stringed instruments. But he took the hard road and became, competent and skilled with that craft of playing. My second son, he actually forged the rings that are the wedding rings that he and his wife wear. He taught himself how to do it. So you remember that Ron Swanson episode where he takes the sconce and he makes a couple of rings kind of out of that sconce. My second son actually did that. They're gold.
That's great.
And they look great. I mean, they look like you. So he bought the diamond. He created the engagement ring, set it himself, and then forged the ring that he wears and the ring that his wife wears. And it was entirely self-taught. I remember him experimenting with brass. There were probably 30 or 40 rings that he made out of brass before he was ready for actually doing it with gold. That's probably an exaggeration. It was probably far fewer than that. But anyway, I remember him doing it in the garage. What are you working on? I'm making the rings. That kind of thing.
That's great.
But
that's
both of them,
wonderful.
in terms of how I work with them over the years, I would see something in them and encourage that, talk to them about it. I would have breakfast. I'd take them out for breakfast once a month, individually, and we just talk about life and what they're doing and that kind of thing. So there was always a really positive kind of interaction between us about everything.
Yeah, that's great. Chris, one of the things I want to ask you is when we look at some of the books you've written and the ones that we tend to share with young man Dan when we're counseling people, Man of the House, and then your book through canon, The Household and the War for the Cosmos. My question to you on those books, you've got a lot of ideas like patriarchy and pietas and, really productive property, stuff that you've talked a lot about. My question is, what was it in your life that brought those things? Like, when did you start thinking about those subjects and starting to realize, like, yeah, I'm going to get into real estate, so I have something to pass on to my kids, competence, property, the restaurant. Like, where did all this come from?
Well, I grew up in very progressive settings, and I knew that they were all morons. And so I didn't really think that they had anything to teach me about much of anything. Even as a kid, I was completely, I guess, disillusioned with the left. There was a period of time where I dabbled a bit for a couple of years, kind of in Marxist theory and stuff like that. But particularly the sexual revolution stuff, I always thought was just nuts. So what that did is, when I was younger and having kids, I thought, well, I need to think about, what are the models? And there was a high regard that I had for those blue collar guys in Western Pennsylvania. They knew how to do things. They worked with their hands. When I was in seminary, I worked for a commercial contractor, worked my way through seminary initially with him, and then I was in a collaborative with a bunch of other seminary guys, and we built decks and did framing and stuff like that all over Kansas City. So I learned the trades that way. So this is the fun thing. I look back in those days with great fondness. So we would all jump in our trucks after class in the morning at seminary and head out to the work sites. It'd be 90 degrees outside. We'd have our shirts off. We're sweating like pigs. And all whole time we're arguing theology as we're building.
Yes.
We're shouting at each other and stuff like that, quoting theologians at each other. Those were great days and great guys. But anyway, that's what introduced me personally to the trades. After having those models back in Western Pennsylvania that I admired, and then when it came to just the subject of patriarchy, because I knew that the left was not sound in terms of its approach to family life, I took an interest in learning about how the household was understood prior to the modern era, and that's what got me into Xenophon and Aristotle and so forth. And as I worked with those writers, I came to see that they were misrepresented by modern thinkers, and that essentially they were libeled. They weren't presented in the best light, not even in a good light, but just simply their motives, their ways of doing things were dismissed as benighted and cruel and so forth. But once you get into it, once you understand what actually was sort of required in order to make a household work in a world prior to the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the welfare state, you see that it had to work the way it did. And what I needed to do at that point is say, is this still the case? Is it still the case that we need men to think and behave in these terms, or are men actually obsolete? And I came after thinking about it maybe 2 minutes. No, they're not obsolete. In fact, every single household that I had personally, sort of seen that was successful was headed by a father who authoritatively cared for his family. And did so in ways that were patriarchal in character. It doesn't mean that they, didn't love and appreciate their wives and didn't respect the choices their kids made, but they comported themselves with a level of personal authority that most people think is either impossible to practice, or if it is practiced, it's got to be horrendously oppressive. But I saw those guys raise young women who went on to be happy and fruitful women, happy and fruitful sons. And so I said, okay, I need to be the advocate for this truth, this reality. It's in the best interest of men and women. It's in the best interest of even our political order. Because if the household collapses, if we don't see functional households, thriving, well, the welfare state's just going to continue to absorb, these desperately needy people who have no other recourse but to rely upon it. So anyway, all of that was in play. When it comes to real estate, I just always wanted to own my own stuff. And that was really all there was to it initially. But as I grew in my appreciation of the household and its basis as a productive economy, I came to see that in antiquity, Middle Ages, whatever, productive property was always at the center of every household enterprise. And since that was the case, I thought, well, we need to see that today as well. And I think we're actually in a great moment where the prospects for recovering the productive household are as good or better than they've been in a century.
Why do you think that, Chris?
Well, it has to do with, paradoxically, the internet and what we are able to achieve today. So what we're seeing is the kind of the the diffusion or the decentralization of even the industrial machinery of our society, and because of the ability to communicate and work together intellectually and even manufacture and ship things, I think that we are at a point where we could see people being able to live where they want to live and still participate in the global economy. So I'm not a Luddite. I think that there are great things about the past. I think there are great things about the present. What we need to do is find creative approaches to bringing the best of both together.
Yeah, I think that's really important. One of the other questions related to this in the real estate, you kind of have two sides, right? Where people right now are like, oh, everything, it's going to crash, whatever. But I think you've said there's actually a lot of opportunity. So for somebody who wants to get into it, sees the value of it, says, yeah, I want to get into the real estate. Just curious, like where you started, maybe that's different than what you would recommend with today, but what would you say is a good place for people to begin?
Well, I think small town America is where the opportunities are today. When I was getting started, the opportunities were in the inner city. It's hard for people to appreciate just how different like life was in inner city Boston in the late 80s and early 90s. When we had the crack epidemic, I was mugged by two guys outside the Ashmont T station with a machete. I was in
Wow.
I was at the Shabu gang fight that made the front page of the Boston Globe. My truck was stolen from Codman Square in the middle of the day. I remember pulling away, and I was running down the street after it. It was a wild time.
Man,
Wow.
it sounds like you should have been a gunfighter. I'm just saying.
Well, actually, we even had a crack addict who lived with us for a while.
Oh, wow.
It was a different world. I mean, so if you remember like films like Escape from New York or Escape from LA, the reason why those films were like produced is because people were wondering, are we descending into that kind of chaos? Like Escape
Even
from New York.
like Charles Bronson.
Oh, yeah.
What was
Oh yeah, yeah,
Death Wish.
yeah.
But it was
right.
about like surviving New York and getting mugged. Like,
Oh yeah, yeah. So I remember the '70s. I remember being in Times Square and being propositioned by prostitutes every like block. The only people who were selling anything in Times Square at that time were guys who were like trying to sell stolen goods out of their like trunks, stuff like that. That was
Sounds
New
like
York.
Shanghai.
It was a wild world. And if you said, I live in Dorchester, people would say, oh, that's dangerous. How do you live there? Well, that's where I bought my first property. And they were desperate. So banks and municipalities, cities across America were giving you great deals. So I got in at like 5% down.
wow.
But the interest rate was 8 3/4. So it was a great opportunity, a great time to buy, precisely because no one wanted to live there. No one anticipated the Rudy Giuliani, broken windows policing thing having the impact that it did. No one anticipated. So I got into a little spat with Tim Keller the other day on Twitter, where I basically said the reason why your whole model worked is because of Rudy Giuliani, and he took issue with me on some things. And anyway, but it's true. Today, that's where, cool, hip people want to live. Nobody was thinking that in the early 90s. So today, it's a different scene. Everything is gentrified. Everything is priced way out of sight.
That was a big deal, right? I mean, I know I saw you talking about that too, but this whole, like for 20 years, I mean, early ministry and pastorate that I experienced, everything was about for the city,
Yeah.
for the city, for the city. And some of that now, I don't know if you think it's shifting, but it seems like people are starting to realize, well, actually a small town would be a lot easier to capture if you wanted to change a place and really invest in it and see change.
There's that. But the other part of it is a lot of these urban leaders don't have the best interests of the young people that they're talking to in mind. Essentially, let's say you want to go to San Francisco. Okay, what's your prospects for buying a house in San Francisco? What's your prospect for
Like
buying
zero.
a house even in the great? Yeah, that's exactly right. You are an indentured servant for Jesus. That's it. You got zero chance because you're not just competing with other people like yourself. You're competing with investors. You're competing with foreign money, wealthy people. So let me give you an example. When I remember being in the Lambs Club in Times Square. I was involved with a kind of consultation on urban youth ministry, and it was still very seedy, rundown. I remember there was this protest that occurred right outside the building with a bunch of Marxists going down the street beating drums, and it was just nuts. Today, the Lambs Club is the home to a 5-star restaurant that one of the Iron Chefs has established. And the airspace above the Lambs Club was sold for $100 million. I'm talking about vacant air space. I know the guy who did the deal. Yeah, I know the guy who did the deal. He's an old mentor of mine. But anyway, you think about that. That is now the most expensive hotel in New York. I think it's like $10,000 a night to stay there.
Whoa!
Think about that. So you go from this like Charles Bronson Death Wish scene that nobody wants anything to do with, where people were like begging you. Like, and I lived in Central Square in Cambridge back during the days of rent control. You could buy a 2-family in Cambridge for $150,000.
Wow.
Today, that same property is $2 million.
Whoa.
It's a different world.
Yeah.
So where can you find good deals today? Small town America. They're begging people. You got the same kind of dynamics even. Opioid crisis, people say, oh, I don't want to live in this, sort of depressed area. That's where the opportunities are. Now, if like the state of Vermont will pay you $12,000 to move there. So if you're a remote worker, they set it up precisely for this purpose. They say, we need people. We need young people. Please move to Vermont. Now, people say, well, it's liberal. Of course, whatever, but you've got opportunity there. And you can buy some beautiful old 19th century, early 20th century homes, for like $200,000 or less. Yeah, they need a lot of work. Yeah, you're in Rutland, Vermont, which is economically depressed. Yeah, you're surrounded by people in opioids, and you got Bernie Sanders up the road. Yeah, that's all true. but if you're telecommuting, you may be working for some firm out of San Francisco. You're making good money, and you're in a place where you can build some equity. So, and I identified 8 states that will pay you to move there and move into an economically depressed.
There's 8 of them.
Yeah, Arkansas.
Because I thought it was just Alaska.
Yeah, Alaska's one of them. Iowa's one of them. Minnesota's another one. So there are a lot of places where you can get some, where there's real opportunity. And if you're either an entrepreneur and you want to like start something, you got all kinds of, tax incentives, even capital that people want to invest in efforts to start businesses in these areas. And, cash. Arkansas. I think Arkansas will pay you like $12,000. West Virginia. Now, so let's say you don't like, Bernie Sanders, but you love mountains and greenery. Move to West Virginia. It's great. It's a beautiful place. It's as beautiful as Vermont. I've been in both places. They're both great.
That's crazy. So I'm interested, Chris. We've seen a lot of shift and change the last couple of years. People moving for various reasons, COVID, all that. I wonder, being in real estate, have you seen any patterns develop? Is there a settling theme happening? How do you see the change resulting, I guess, in fruit? I don't know if it's too early to tell.
Well, this is my 4th correction, so each one has its own flavor.
Yeah.
So the thing that happened in 2008 occurred because of the subprime mortgage thing, and then the bundling of mortgages. So that's not the case this time. The case this time is there were a lot of investment firms that got into residential real estate, and they were buying up entire neighborhoods and then just renting them out. It seemed to make sense in terms of return on investment, but now it no longer does, and they're starting to lose money, and many of them are losing so much money that they're going out of business. And I think that what we're seeing now is a lot of property kind of working its way back onto the market. Now, in the first phase of this process, there's a lot of money that's been sitting on the side waiting. That has to be exhausted before the real opportunities are there for people. So we may be 9 months to 2 years out from the real bottom. because it does take a while for these things to play out. But I do think that even then, there are still opportunities. I was just talking to somebody about places in Connecticut that I think have a lot of upside, and I encouraged him to look at those places. They tend to be kind of gritty areas, but a lot of character, and I think could be turnaround communities. So you can do something today. You can wait. I think. I don't know if we'll see the same kind of correction we saw in 2008. They were like huge opportunities then. I bought a 2-family for 50 cents on the dollar right after the crash. It was owned by Deutsche Bank. They were in Connecticut. I don't know why they were in Connecticut, but anyway, it was a foreclosure, and I got it. And that was actually a property that my boys worked with me on, and we still own it. So I don't think we'll see that kind of collapse, but I do think we're in the midst of a correction that's going to take a while to play out.
Yeah, really interesting.
Yeah, so I'm just curious, we've been talking a lot about millennials, economic opportunities and things like that. I guess just what words of encouragement would you give to younger guys right now that probably feel like they're beat up? I know, like, just counseling men right now. I've got some guys who are blue collar guys. They have degrees in like welding or CNC machining, and they can't even buy a house. Like what encouragement would you give to these guys?
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of things to keep in mind. I bought my first property when I was 33, 34.
Mm-hmm.
So both of my sons are doing better than me. One of my sons bought his home when he was 28, and the other one bought his home when he was 23. I would encourage them to think, not be discouraged, to see that they're particularly if they're in their 20s and early 30s, they should be working to position themselves to take advantage of the opportunity when it arrives. I would encourage them to keep their eyes open and become familiar with the market. I must have looked at, 20 places before I bought my first place. You have to have that kind of exposure to the market to recognize the deal when you have it. Otherwise, you might miss it. You might not read the situation well. So I would say keep looking, keep preparing, keep putting money aside to prepare for that. Then I would also encourage them to learn about various opportunities and programs. So when I talk to young guys who are discouraged in this way, I'll say, have you talked to a realtor yet? Most of the time they haven't. They're just dealing with sticker shock. They're not actually sitting down with. So what I would say is you want to find a veteran who's maybe gone through 2 or 3 cycles, who has a kind of knowledge of the market that, say, your cousin who just got his real estate license doesn't have.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like my mentor in real estate was a guy who is in his 80s now. He's been doing this for over 55 years. I just took him with my second son to look at a property in Connecticut, 18 acres, a house that was built in 1840 on the market for $375.
Whoa.
Without buildings, in a beautiful town in rural Connecticut. They're out there. The deals are out there. In fact, one of the things I suggested to my old mentor, as I said, hey, if I offered them $250 for this, what would you do? He said, I'd put it in an envelope and send it to him and make sure I wasn't around. But yeah, I would do it. And so I remember years ago, I had him take me out to look at some 2-families, and we were together, and we looked at maybe 3 of them, and he said, you need to go bigger. I was like, really? He said, yeah, you need to go bigger. And I said, well, how big? He said, how about 16? I said, you're kidding me. So we took a look at a 16-unit apartment complex that was on the market. I bought it. If you had asked me before, that conversation with that mentor, do you think you could pull that off? I would have said, no way. But I did it. Now, I went all out. I had 3 loans on that property to make that deal happen. I mortgaged my house.
Man.
I made a lot of money on that deal. I sold it before the crash in 2008, so I did really well on it. But a mentor like that will say, I know. So in his case, this is kind of funny. He said, I'm on the board of the bank. Let's go talk to the senior vice president. So we did. And before we went in, my mentor said, bankers aren't all that smart. He said, if they were smart, they'd do what we're doing. And I was like, really? So we were in there, and I'm like, at this point, I'm maybe like 40 years old, 41, something like that. And we're sitting talking to the senior vice president of commercial lending at this bank. And we're working out the arrangement to actually make the deal happen. And he looks at me and says, I should be doing what you're doing. I looked over at my mentor, and we just both smiled at each other. And anyway, it's just a fun story. But a good mentor who knows the local market will know everything about what really is going on there, what the opportunities are, what the funding sources are, what you can actually get accomplished. So a lot of guys just don't realize that your first purchase, you don't need 20%. You really don't.
Interesting.
You may be able to get into your property for 5% or maybe even 3%. First-time home buyer programs are designed to help you get into property.
Yes.
Those are still out there. I've probably done over the course of my time as an investor, but also of representing I've probably done 75 deals. You'd just be astonished at the ways deals can get done. So don't be discouraged. You just need somebody who knows the local situation, knows how to set up the funding. It's like in the case with my second son, we're looking at this property. Like 2 days after I'm looking at it, I'm with another friend who's got some finances, and I describe it to him, and he says, that's exactly the sort of thing I'm interested in. So I connected him with my son. So my son might get into this property with a partner who's might be able to buy the entire property cash. So there are all sorts of things that can develop if you just keep your eyes open, get connected to the right people, and think out loud and talk about what you'd like to do. You might discover that there are people out there that can give you help that you'd never suspect would be able to help.
Yeah, there are some opportunities I know locally with seller financing as well.
Yeah.
Because the banks are challenging to work with. There are opportunities, but it sounds like, doing something is better than doing nothing. I know that's something you're going to talk about in your book, Risk, but you had published an article some years ago about the barbell of risk. That was, absolutely reformational in my life.
Especially, I think, for pastors, when we were pastoring, thinking about that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm just wondering, as far as that barbell of risk, you said you had 3 loans out and everything like that. I'm guessing that all of your weights weren't stacked on that side. You might have been a little heavy on one side, but did you have balance in that? Or was that what inspired the article to say, hey, maybe you shouldn't do this?
Yeah, no, I had other properties at that time. I had a lot of competence. This wasn't like my first rodeo. And I had extensive networks. So when it comes to this illustration of the barbell, I got it from Nassim Nicholas Taleb, the guy who wrote The Black Swan and Anti-Fragile. And his point is that for every risk you take, you need some kind of counterweight. So that's the barbell.
Yeah.
If you're way out here on the right, you need something really stable on the left. It kind of works like a cantilever. So like in a cantilever, as you know, you've got this platform that sticks out from a building that doesn't appear to have any support. Actually, it's got a lot of support. It's tied in to the building at the far end. So generally a cantilever is as deep into the structure of the building as you see it go out on the other side, and anchored in a way that makes it capable of bearing the weight that it's going to have to bear when you're on the end of it. And that's the way you should think about risk. If you're going to take a big risk like I took at that time, I was probably my net worth was probably as great as I was borrowing. So there's that. But the other thing is my networks were really strong. I had a really solid, trusting wife, and that's super important. Your wife and your relationship with your wife is one of those anchoring points. So we would talk, what are we going to do if this blows up? Well, we'll do this, we'll do that, that kind of stuff. So we had
cardboard
plans.
Boxes can keep you dry.
That's right. So we had, networks, professional networks, and otherwise. But then as I noted, I also had some financial counterbalances or other things in my life. So yeah, it's just an important concept to keep in mind. You don't want to be so sometimes guys make the mistake of betting the whole farm on the very first thing, and they have nothing
Yeah.
sort of like to fall back on or no plan B. And of course, your wife is going to be a kind of uneasy about that. She's like, yeah, I love you, and yeah, I trust you, but really? Do we want to live in cardboard boxes if this?
Yeah. Is that the target?
That's right.
Yes.
Is that the fallback position? Right.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Chris, we really appreciate you coming on the show to talk with us. Of course, we'll be pushing out more information about the Risk book as that approaches. Very excited to read that and excited to share it with our audience. So again, sir, thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, glad to do it. Thanks for having me on the show.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks for listening in on that interview. We hope that you found it helpful. Make sure you check out Pastor Wiley's books and all the different resources that he has. There's a lot of wisdom to plumb there that we would encourage you to check out and continue learning from him. If you haven't already, put those books on your shelf and look forward to the book that he'll be publishing, Lord willing, with New Christendom Press in the not too distant future. As always, we want to encourage you to check out some of the links in the description of the show. There are ways to support the King's Hall podcast, help us continue to make high-quality Christian content that pushes forward the plow in the work of building New Christendom. One of the big things we'd like to highlight right now is actually a conference that we have coming up. And it's an opportunity for you, your friends, pastors, to join us here in Ogden, Utah, June 8th to the 10th, year of our Lord 2023. We're going to be putting on an absolutely glorious conference.
Glorious.
Glorious.
Yes, and the other thing that is glorious, Dan.
Glorious.
Oh, there it is.
Got through the whole episode. I thought we weren't going to have
No,
that.
I couldn't do it to Chris. I didn't feel like that would have been
No.
maybe bad taste.
No,
he wouldn't have got the joke.
He just closes the laptop
He
and
just-
leaves.
I'm done.
And you deserve it.
But if you come to the conference, you get to meet Dan face to face. And let me tell you, meeting Dan face to face, life changing. I'm not going to say for the better
It
or
will
worse,
change
but
your
it will
life.
change your
It
life.
will alter the course of your destiny.
Your
I
destiny.
mean,
yes.
you're welcome.
Yeah. You are the plan. That's going to be the theme of the conference. We want to equip you to go home and be encouraged and exhorted to do the work of building where you are in your church's community, home, business, vocation, and even really more than the conference sessions. One thing that we really hope to see happen through this conference is for you to make friends, for you to network, meet other Christians who are like, I mean, some of you probably feel alone where you're at. Like there's nobody else who thinks the way you think, and they all look at you like you're insane when you say some of the things that we'd normally say here on the King's Hall. You're going to meet a lot of like-minded people here in Ogden if you can make it out.
Yeah, I love it. A lot of it, I think, is networking. Like
Yes.
you said, a lot of conferences, you get a lot of talking.
Yeah.
And listen, Brian, I love talking.
Who doesn't?
Who doesn't? Well,
Dan.
Actually, you're right.
Actually,
Yeah, we both
I
were
do
like,
know,
we know
okay.
the answer.
We're on the same. We finish each other's sandwiches.
Sandwiches.
Is how it goes.
That was amazing.
That was, yes.
That was amazing. You know what else is amazing about this conference is that seating is limited.
What?
Seating is limited.
Actually, not amazing.
Well, one benefit is that it's not going to be 50,000 people. I know, of course, King's Hall could fill arenas, right?
right.
No, okay.
It depends on the size of the arena.
That's right.
Yeah, like
But
a
the-
Zoolander arena.
The seating is limited. We wanted the conference to have that church family feel, and so we are putting it on at Refuge Church, at our historic church building, and we only have so many seats, so seating is limited. Make sure you go check your calendar, sign up, get a ticket if you haven't already. There is a link in the description of this episode for you to get all the details and get a ticket there. We're going to be singing psalms. We're going to be feasting. We're going to be learning, hanging out, being friends.
Oh, you
It's gonna
said
be a good
sea
time.
shanties?
We're going to be sea shantying. Eric is going to put on a concert of musical interpretations of
Dance. Yeah, through
dance
dance.
interpretations.
Yeah.
Actually, I've been reading about the shofar.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh, you're gonna let her rip,
Shofar
huh?
solo.
Hey,
You
you
know-
want to see revival in Christendom?
Blow the shofar.
I
You
do.
gotta blow the
hey,
shofar.
I want these guys to get their tickets quick before the feds buy any. So
Yeah, seriously, guys. We don't want the feds. We don't want the feds showing up.
no Fed boys.
No Fed boys.
No Fed boys.
Well, I think that's all we've got on this episode of the King's Hall. So thanks for listening. And remember, wink it, quisa wink it, he conquers who conquers himself. And we will catch you next time in the King's Hall.